He was my neighbor, someone I waved to over the fence, someone who brought over a pie once, someone who knew my daughter's name. Then one night, he killed her. That sentence lands like a bullet because it happened in a place where we felt safe. On our block, under a street lamp, with porch lights watching and people pretending not to see. I stood over the curb while officers did their work, while Harold's hands trembled just enough to look real, while the neighborhood rearranged itself into whispers and excuses. They called it an accident at first. They called it under investigation. Those labels were soft blankets over a raw wound, and the system's calm made me angrier than any shout. I'm a cop. I trusted that the law would speak for my daughter. When the law moved at a polite pace, my grief moved like a storm. I decided I couldn't wait. What I did next wasn't in any manual. No courtroom drama, no neat verdict. It was something colder, quieter, and more precise, and it changed everything about the people I thought I knew. If you want the truth, if you can handle how far a father will go, stay with me to the end. If this grips you, hit like and subscribe so this story doesn't disappear into the noise. My name is Daniel. I wore the badge for 20 years because I believed in a simple contract. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, come home to your family, and sleep knowing the city is a little safer. My daughter Emily was the reason I kept that promise. She was 8 when she learned to whistle, and 10 when she decided she liked wearing my old knitted cap around the house because it made her feel brave. She collected small things, paper cranes, broken toy soldiers, stickers from bakery runs, and arranged them on her windowsill like trophies of ordinary joy. Our days had rituals that felt sacred. I packed her lunch when I worked the early shift and hid a little note in the sandwich bag that said, "Be brave." I paced the edge of the playground even when I was tired because she would always look back for me. On Fridays, we baked something ridiculous. One week it was cinnamon pretzel muffins. Another week it was pancakes shaped like monsters. And she announced each experiment with the solemnity of a general. Those rituals built a small universe between us that not even the rougher parts of my job could flatten. Harold had been part of that universe. He lived 3 houses down in a split level with a porch light that stayed on until midnight. He mowed his lawn at odd hours, offered to fix loose fence boards, and carried a slow, careful smile. People said he was quiet and dependable. He brought a pie once after Emily scraped her knee. I remember the way he spoke to her, low and patient, as if he were explaining the weather. That made him harmless in everyone's eyes. But there were bits that never fit perfectly. Harold would show up with a story that landed a little askew, too detailed about things no one else could have seen, or too vague about the moments that mattered. He laughed at the wrong pauses. Once, after a neighborhood rainstorm, I saw a smear of mud on the sleeve of his jacket that looked suspiciously like tire track residue. I filed it away like a loose paper, thinking I would look closer later. Another time, he asked Emily a question about her bus route, in a tone that was oddly specific, as if he were rehearsing someone else's memory. I trusted the neighborhood because trust is the muscle you use to live without constant fear. We wave across fences and hand over keys to the house sitter because we believe in one another. But trust can be a blindfold. The people you nod to can be actors who learned their lines. Emily's laughter filled our house every afternoon, and Harold fit into that soundtrack like an extra instrument. Learning the melody before you learn the harm is how danger hides. The small mismatches stacked up like loose shingles on a roof, until one night the roof finally caved. The things I had tucked away, the slightly off memory, the muddy sleeve, the questions that landed wrong, became a map with a glaring red X in the center. My daughter, under a street lamp, gone. When that happened, every ordinary detail became an accusation I could no longer dismiss. I clung to the rituals of our life because they felt like armor, but some armor has thin spots. The thin spots are where truth often slips through. I was wrong. The party that night looked ordinary. The kind of backyard birthday where string lights trembled and paper plates rattled in a shallow breeze. September smelled of charred burgers and wet pavement. Emily's laugh cut through it, bright, reckless. The sound I promised myself I would always protect. I called her 3 times that night. The last call was a burst of giggles and the promise she'd be home soon. That promise became a hole I could not fill. The precinct phone rang like an alarm in the dark. When I reached the street, the scene had already rearranged into tape, flashlights, and hushed voices. A street lamp hummed above a small, terrible pool of light. Emily lay near the curb. She looked smaller than she should, as if the world had taken a little off her edges. The hush around her felt louder than any siren. Harold was there. He stood at a distance with hands that wouldn't settle. He said he found her and called for help. At first his voice sounded like the script of a shocked neighbor, measured, soft. But as officers asked the same questions in different ways, his story began to show folds. He told them he saw a car speed away, then later said he thought he might have seen someone fleeing on foot. One account had him calling 911 immediately. Another suggested he hesitated. Those shifts were small alone, but they clustered into a shape that would not be ignored. I watched the officers work, noting the way they cataloged items and drew chalk lines that only those who have been at a scene would understand. The scene produced facts, and I cataloged those facts like a man making a list to survive. The details that didn't line up, Harold's conflicting times, a smudge on his jacket, the way his hands trembled only when he spoke about the minutes before, threaded through my attention like a needle. Grief sharpens you. It taught me to listen for the wrong notes in speech and to watch for the small truths people drop when they think no one is looking. Standing in that circle of light, everything I had trusted about my block recoiled into suspicion. The evening turned the neighborhood from comfort to cage. I left the curb with my daughter's last laugh looping behind my ribs, and one hard question. What had Harold done in those minutes when Emily's life flickered out? Right now. My colleagues moved through the scene with the trained calm of people who have to keep their heads while everything else collapses. They took photographs, dusted for prints, bagged a shoe, measured the distance from curb to bloodstain. They read from protocols the way priests read liturgy, words meant to steady hands and slow panic. I watched them do their jobs and felt two things at once: pride in their discipline and an edge of fury that the discipline sometimes felt like a slow-acting salve where I wanted open wounds to be exposed. The system has a rhythm: reports, forensics requests, logging, lab cues. It is a useful rhythm most days, but that rhythm is also a clock that can outlast a person's need for answers. Forensics told us the DNA swabs would take weeks. Traffic camera footage had to be subpoenaed and processed. Witness statements required time-consuming corroboration. Each procedural step was a promise of rigor, and each promise added days to a timeline I could not afford. Small things started to stick out. Harold's pickup truck, which I'd seen idling the night of the party, had a fresh scratch on the passenger door. It was thin, the kind made by a scrape against metal. The truck's mud flaps had a smear that matched the color of dirt at the curb where Emily fell. A corner store camera across the street yielded footage, but the license plate was blurred by a passing tree limb, and the angle caught only the truck's rear for a single second. In isolation, each of these details could be shrugged off. Together, they felt like a pattern someone was trying to hide in plain sight. When I asked the lead detective about the scratch and the footage, his answer was patient and procedural. "We'll run it through. We can't jump to conclusions." He was right, officially. But official rightness felt like a cold blanket over a wound that needed surgical light. There were also practical barriers I did not expect. Harold had an alibi given by a neighbor who'd seen him on the porch, and that neighbor's credibility carried weight. Family reputation, community ties. These are invisible currencies in an investigation. They dampened suspicion. Worse was the way information diffused. A lab backlog delayed toxicology. The corner store footage was cataloged and scheduled. People who might have stepped forward did not, citing jobs or fear, or the belief that it's a family matter. Each delay, each small refusal, felt like an erasure of my daughter's life. I stood in briefing rooms and listened to timelines move slowly forward on whiteboards, while the ache inside me moved like a drum, urgent and relentless. Impartial procedure is a shield, until it becomes a barrier. The more I watched the system protect its process, the more I felt it protect possibility, including the possibility that Harold's account would stand. That realization sharpened something in me. If the machine could be patient, I could not be. Grief arrived like a weather front that never quite passed. At first it was a fog, calls I didn't return, interviews I drifted through, a father who could recite Emily's favorite cereal, but forgot the color of the sky outside her classroom the day she learned to whistle. Nights were the worst. The house kept the shape of her absence, and every small sound folded into memory. I found myself replaying the last call on loop, searching for anything I'd missed. That loop hardened into an ache that refused consolation. One night, standing in my kitchen with a light that hummed too loud, I held Emily's little jacket. It smelled like marker and the faint tang of the apples we bought at the Saturday stand. I pressed the sleeve to my face, and for a moment the grief swallowed me whole. Then something in me shifted. Grief, I realized, could be a tombstone or a tool. To lay her to rest in silence felt like surrender. I could not, would not, let her life be folded into polite waiting lists and procedural timelines. While the man who had been our neighbor still drank his coffee on his porch, the decision did not come as fury alone. It arrived as a cold, steady resolve. I thought of every small mismatch I'd noticed. Harold's misplaced details, the smear of mud on his jacket, the way his hands trembled when he told his story. Those fragments, if arranged, could speak louder than an oath. I promised myself I would not be reckless. I am a cop, and my training taught me the borderlines of right and wrong. But training also taught me to see patterns, to follow threads until they led somewhere. I would use what the law allowed and push where it was slow. I set rules for myself in that kitchen. I would collect, not concoct. I would document, not destroy. I would be precise, patient, and relentless. I would interview, observe, and gather the scraps the system disregarded as circumstantial. Memory became my map. Patience became my instrument. Evidence would be the language I used to force a verdict of truth into a process that moved too leisurely for a father's grief. When I slid Emily's jacket back into the closet, I did so with a plan forming in my head. Small, methodical steps that would pull the neighborhood's quiet apart, thread by thread. Grief had sharpened into purpose. I was no longer only a grieving father. I was an investigator of my own child's last night, and I intended to see every hidden corner lit. I learned early that evidence is rarely dramatic. It is a folded receipt in a trash can, a torn ribbon caught on a fence, a hair clip slipped under a porch board. So I started there. Small, patient, ugly work that a grieving father can get away with because nobody suspects the man pacing his daughter's route every afternoon. First, I watched. I walked Emily's stretch of sidewalks at the same hour she would have been walking home. I timed the glances, counted license plates, noted when Harold's pickup left and returned. Observation is a slow burn. It turns strangers into habits and habits into timelines. One evening, under the yellow wash of a street lamp, I saw Harold's truck idling for longer than seemed necessary. He stepped out, lingered near the curb, then climbed back in. My heart tried to tell me what the camera would later confirm. I started taking things the world gives away. I picked up a crumpled paper cup from the curb near the party house and found a smear of red that, under a simple test kit, matched the profile they later called Emily's. I found a small plastic hair clip under Harold's hedgerow, bright purple, the exact kind Emily favored. It had a tiny scratch on the clasp. When I held it, the room narrowed, and the clip felt like an accusation. I became a quiet collector. I asked for a favor from a clerk at the corner store. She'd been reluctant at first, but I coaxed a copy of the CCTV the night of the party. The footage was grainy, the angle cruelly unhelpful at first, but I spent nights replaying a single second until it stretched into meaning. For one frame, the rear of a truck matched Harold's model. For one frame, a shadow near the curb fell like a hand. Those small frames stitched into a larger cloth of suspicion. Then there were the messages. I begged a friend in IT, one I'd helped years ago when he was younger and reckless, to recover deleted text fragments from a phone backup. He did it, quietly, in the dead hours, because sometimes favors repaid are the most honest currency. A partial string of a text emerged, an odd phrase Harold used only when he was nervous, a timestamp that contradicted his statement to officers. It was not a smoking gun. It was a thread. Collecting threads is not innocent. I trespassed once into a yard to photograph a tire mark beneath Harold's truck. I know how that reads, how it looks when a cop crosses the line into private vengeance. My badge felt heavy in my pocket that night, heavy with rules I had promised to honor. I told myself the ends justified the means. I told myself the system's slowness had already betrayed Emily. The rationalizations came easily. The conscience did not. There were nights I lay awake, fingers tracing the edge of the law like a seam, wondering when touching it would rip everything apart. Still, the evidence built in increments. A receipt for heavy-duty plastic from a hardware store tucked into Harold's trash, a smear of dirt on His truck matched to the curb soil under Emily's shoes. The hair clip, the cup, each item by itself could be explained away. Altogether, they made a pattern that no amount of coincidence could comfortably hold. That pattern gave me leverage. Nothing legal yet, but pressure. Pressure is a force. It bends people. It makes them reveal seams they thought hidden. The moral tension tightened as I recorded Harold's comings and goings at odd hours. I set up a small camera across the street, disguised as a porch light. It was invasive. It felt wrong. But every time a figure moved in front of that lens, I felt a small victory. Not the kind that heals, the kind that strains the air until a confession might fall out. My hands were not steady with pride. They were steady with necessity. I did things I swore I would never do. I stepped into yards. I photographed beneath porches. I replayed single frames until meaning bled out of static. Each small success, camera footage that suggested rather than proved, a text that hinted rather than confessed, pushed me further. I knew I was walking a narrow ridge between justice and obsession. I also knew I could not turn back. The threads were gathering. The web was taking shape. The trap would need them all. I rented the little community hall and sent the invitations under a harmless headline. Neighborhood Safety Barbecue. Come discuss ways to keep our kids safe. It was a good lie. People came because they cared, because they wanted to be neighborly, and because a free burger on a warm evening is the kind of small luxury that keeps streets friendly. I paid for the food out of a pocket that still felt too heavy with bills I would never spend. I asked a retired detective friend to sit quietly at the back, and I nudged an old reporter I once helped toward the door. I made sure a couple of uniformed officers would be there, on their own time, as citizens. Everything had to look ordinary. We set up a projector in the hall like it was going to be a slideshow about streetlights and crosswalks. In reality, the screen would hold pieces of a night no one wanted to remember. I arranged a simple display on the table up front, a small plastic hair clip in a clear evidence bag, the crumpled cup with a smear I tested at home, a weathered receipt from a hardware store folded to reveal the purchase of heavy plastic. I wasn't trying to convict in that room. I was trying to remove the comfort of not seeing. Comfort lets people sleep through shame. People filed in. Faces I'd known for years, chairs scraping on the floor. I started by speaking as a father, plain and raw. I did not accuse. I told the room who Emily had been, the small things that make a person irreplaceable. I let them hear the normality of my life before I fractured that normal with my questions. Then I said I had something to show them that might make them look at our block differently. The projector clicked on. The footage was grainy. It was 1 second, stretched like a revelation. The rear of a truck pausing near the curb, a shadow where a person should have clearly been, a silhouette moving in a way that didn't match the story we'd been told. I didn't narrate. I let the images breathe, and the room filled with a sound that is part intake and part closing. The retired detective sat forward. The reporter stopped tapping her phone. People's hands went to the mouths. I then lifted the evidence bag with Emily's clip so everyone could see the bright plastic. I narrated simple facts, where I'd found it, why it mattered, while the clip sat under a light like a tiny accused thing. Then I played a short audio, a fragment of conversation someone had recorded on a phone after the party, a voice saying something I'd heard Harold say once in a different context, an odd phrase that, in context, did not belong. Each small piece didn't prove murder by itself, but together they leaned toward a shape people could finally see. Harold was there, sitting near the back, because he was a neighbor, and because he'd RSVP'd dutifully when I called him concerned. At first he smiled, the easy neighbor smile, and offered to shake hands with folks he knew. When the projector showed the truck frame and the clip, his smile thinned. His hands found the arms of his chair like they could hold him upright. He tried to speak at first in a practiced, calm tone. I was there trying to help, but the room's quiet tightened like a noose around those words. Then, a boy I recognized, one of the parents from the party, stood up. He held his phone. I didn't want to, he said, voice small. I thought it was nothing then, but I saved it. He played a short video, shaky, night lit, the angle of a child's camera catching a truck's door opening, and a figure bending near the curb for a heartbeat. Faces in the room went pale. The retired detective adjusted his glasses and whispered a name I'd already rehearsed in my head. Harold's jaw worked. He called out that the footage was grainy, that anyone could be in that frame. He claimed he'd stopped to tie a shoelace, that he'd gone looking for help, that he had no idea, anything to reframe. Harold tried a different defense when another neighbor, an older woman who once praised him at a PTA meeting, stood and said she'd seen him leave his porch at a certain time and walk quickly down the street. The narrative his alibi had relied on splintered. He switched again. "I panicked," he said, voice high. I didn't want to look like I had done something. I didn't know what to do." Panic is a confession of sorts. It is an admission that behavior failed moral imagination. Still, he plowed on, inventing details to cover the gaps, pointing a trembling finger at a passing, unnamed stranger who supposedly fled the scene. That's when a twist landed like a second blow. Harold's own wife stood up. The room inhaled as though sucked into a sudden vacuum. Her voice was steady, but not cold. "He came home smelling like road dust and something I couldn't place," she said. The words were small, but they carried weight because they were not mine. She said she had not told the police earlier because she was afraid for both of them, of community shaming, of losing a husband. She said she had staged an alibi because she loved him. Her confession reframed everything. Not an innocent neighbor misled by circumstance, but a man whose closest person had covered for him. Harold broke somewhere between those confessions. He stood, voice cracking, tried to swing back into control by accusing me of orchestrating a public spectacle. He shouted that I had no right. The retired detective rose and calmly told him, "You have rights, but you also have questions to answer." Harold lunged, literally, a stumble toward the door, and for a heartbeat my heart leapt into my throat. Someone blocked him, another neighbor's hand on his shoulder, the reporter calling for a calm voice to hold the situation. He was not violent. He was unraveling. When the night ended, Harold left in a police car, not because I dragged him to a station, but because the collection of small truths had made the room heavy and loud enough that the state could no longer pretend it was a family matter. The twist, the wife's confession, the kid's video, the evidence arrayed on paper plates, had done what legalities alone had not. It shattered the neighborhood's inclination to silence and turned bystanders into witnesses. I did not feel triumphant. I felt hollowed out in a new, precise way. The confrontation had opened doors I could not close. What I had hoped would bring closure cracked open other rooms of pain. But one thing was different. Questions were finally being asked out loud, where before they had been only whispers. News vans arrived the next morning like a storm front, lights flashing, cameras hungry for the shape of a story. The neighborhood I had known for years suddenly had its picture taken from every angle. Headlines called it a tragedy, then a scandal. A few used the word betrayal. People I waved to on morning walks avoided my eyes, while others found a courage to step forward and say what they'd seen. The tide of public opinion shifted fast. Where sympathy for Harold once buffered him, suspicion and outrage now closed ranks around my daughter. Prosecutors moved quicker than I expected. The evidence I'd quietly collected, frame-by-frame footage, the hair clip, the cup, the recorded fragment, became the scaffolding of their case. Defense attorneys tried to poke holes. Chain of custody, reasonable doubt, alternative theories. They argued he'd been panicked, that memories are unreliable. But when multiple small items lined up, they stopped feeling like coincidence. My amateur work was no replacement for forensics, but it forced questions the official timeline had missed. In court, there were legal dances, plea offers, motions, a public gallery full of faces I recognized. The system worked imperfectly. It took months. When judgment finally came, it was not the movie ending I'd rehearsed in silence. I didn't cheer. The verdict brought a quiet that felt less like relief and more like a thin, temporary peace. Grief did not leave. It merely settled into new rooms of my life. Justice had a sound, but it was muted. I learned something ugly and necessary. Justice and revenge wear similar faces. Getting Harold arrested didn't stitch Emily back. It rearranged the rooms of my life so sorrow could live somewhere else. I acted because waiting felt like erasing her. I paid a price. Sleep that carries echo, friendships lost, and a line I crossed I will always remember. Was it right? I don't know. What I know is silence kills too. Tell me, what would you do in my shoes? If this moved you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more true stories where justice is never simple.